the number one challenge is always to take them away from technology.
My name is Yaniv Korem. I'm here to study successful innovation professionals and uncover the mindset and models they use to de-risk the future. On this podcast, I invite fellow professors, practitioners, and entrepreneurs to have an honest conversation about the business of innovation. No more bullshit. We talk openly and honestly about what works and what doesn't. So come on, get your ass in that seat. School's about to start. Welcome you back to school.
Hi, Yaniv. Super excited to be here. I can't wait to see where our conversation leads.
Awesome. I'm very glad you're here. How about we start with a little game? Are you
Okay.
up for that?
Yes.
Cool. So complete this sentence for me and please do not overthink it. The sentence is corporates and startups are dot dot dot.
They are playing different games. I find sometimes corporates are playing chess and startups are playing Fortnite. They're just on sometimes just totally different planes of existence, but duking it out in the same field a lot of the time.
That is what makes it interesting, right?
Mhm. Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's interesting when you're talking and trying to advise corporates on a competitive landscape, and you notice that there is a startup in the field. And as always, if the corporate's a little bit behind, they are like, no, these guys are small fry. Don't worry about them. We have the big B to big B relationship with the customer. And I'm just sitting here, just being nice to them, go like, yes, but this startup doesn't care about profitability. They have just gotten funding. They have just 10x the size of their proto and their program with your customer, and you are trying to figure out how to make an extra 1% on your margin. And it's quite an interesting dynamic and a conversation with corporates when you're in this situation with them.
Yeah. Yeah. So almost trying to translate between two different languages.
Yes, and trying to explain it's like teaching them how to play a new game, and they just don't know or they don't understand the rules, and for you it's like actually the rules are really not there. Whereas similarly to our analogy, chess has a lot of structured rules. Like every piece has its kind of way of moving. But when you move into the real world, when you're playing a Fortnite game or a PUBG game, it is essentially almost every man for himself. It's a dynamic map. It's constantly moving. The constraints are constantly closing in. Um, and you sometimes have to do defensive. Sometimes you go on offensive. It's very dynamic. It's no longer a turn by turn basis.
Yeah, I like that analogy. So I want to talk a little bit about what you're doing right now. You're the chief innovation officer at Human at Work, and so could you share what is Human at Work and what you do there?
Yeah, sure. So Human Work is effectively a strategy, innovation, and purpose lab. We're quite specific in the way that we word it, and we don't want to be seen as your stereotypical consultants. What we do is that we go into either corporates or startup worlds and help advise them on strategy, innovation, and purpose. And we kind of saw this as an interesting nexus as we move forward into the next few years. That one, innovation is now used to be just a interesting thing that only large companies did into something that every company needs to do now. Whether they actually do or not is a different problem. Purpose is now a much bigger issue and on the table, especially I think it started way back with sustainability, ESG goals, and then now people are starting to awaken it up into like, okay, like what actually is our purpose and what value are we delivering to the world and to our stakeholders beyond financial and shareholders, and of course all tied together with strategy. So I lead the innovation piece. I have a dual mandate. One side looking at the large corporates in terms of helping them kind of work through some corporate innovation strategies and kind of programs and processes. And on the other side, I'm probably my stronger passion is working with startup founders to find ways to help them supercharge their business as they start to scale, using basically my background from large corporate, working with startups at Li Fong. So that's in a nutshell what I do and sort of what Human at Work does.
So take me back uh, to stuff that you were doing prior to Human at Work, and if you could maybe reflect on these things and how the different things that you've done in the past kind of all tie together to what you're doing now. How has that sort of shaped what you're doing right now?
Sure. I have to say my career path till now has been very boring. I was a almost a career man at Li Fong, and you all know Li Fong very well. Supply chain manager in the fast moving consumer goods industry. I started off as a management trainee, and by the time I left, I was looking after some innovation programs. I had pushed through some large culture work throughout the entire organization, and also had a essentially like a firefighter on special projects at a corporate level. So I think my experience really helped drive into me the ability to stay agile and flexible. I would be dropped into projects where I would have zero expertise and zero knowledge of the matter, but be very quick to assess what was going on and kind of bring transparency and utilize data to kind of help shoot through any problems. Um, the culture piece really showed me how important culture was and how much there was uh, hidden within organizations, what was unsaid and unknown, and how that can be both be harnessed for good and for bad. As I went through and I went through almost all of our offices to see our people, and I think the humanity there really kind of shaped the way I think about business and how business should be built and run around people. Um, and then finally, the final piece around innovation, which actually stemmed from the culture piece, was that innovation needs to fundamentally come from your culture. And yeah, I think you will agree with me on this, in that you cannot build an innovation lab and be suddenly overnight innovative as a company. You cannot do hackathons until you become innovative as a company. There are many things around innovation theater that can be done and money can be spent, but at the end of the day, you need to go back to your culture, and so that kind of shaped a lot of the thinking that I had. And the final piece just before I left was kind of this building, helping Liam Fong and Fong Group build an ecosystem to start to build partnerships and potentially interesting pilots with startups. The company realized that we needed to kind of look outside a little bit more. The solutions to our problems were unlikely to come from ourselves. And so we started the work. I think it started the Explorium in itself. That was the last place I was before I left. Started in Shanghai. I think they did well there. And we started off the Hong Kong one. And yeah, and just leveraged the work that we had with the startup ecosystem in Hong Kong to bring in some fresh, innovative ideas into the company to help solve some of the problems that we were seeing.
So you mentioned Li and Fong. You managed a program there called the workshop.
Yes, the workshop that was at Lianfeng before we got pushed into the group.
So, and we're talking like for our audience who doesn't know Li and Fong or the Fong Group, we're talking about huge organizations, right? Tens of thousands of people, a lot of business units spread across the globe.
Yep. At the phone group level, it was something like 40 to 50,000 people globally. I think we're in almost every major country in the world, doing everything from retail down to managing supply chains and manufacturing. So it was a pretty sizable and large business.
So, looking at Li and Fong as a huge organization and some of the huge organizations that you work with today, what's your number one challenge, or what are some of your bigger challenges in trying to drive innovation in these organizations?
The number one challenge is always to take them away from technology. Um, every large organization likes to throw all the buzzwords you can think of, I've heard them all, and they sort of just lose sight of what they're trying to do. So a lot of the time we go back to basics. We always forget AI, forget data, forget this, forget blockchain. I'm like the number of times I just had to hear these words, and I just nod for the first like 10 minutes and like, oh, we are being disrupted by this blockchain startup. Da, 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 we need to do this. I'm like, okay, you've said your piece, but what are you trying to solve? So I think that is always the biggest challenge in large corporate. They just lose sight of what they're trying to solve, and whether it's a large financial institution or a large supply chain company or large any kind of company, they just jump into the technology. We need to have AI. We need to have data. We need to hire data scientists. I'm like, but what are you trying to do, right? Are you trying to build a better customer experience? And then if you are, why? Why do you need a better customer experience? Right. And then what's the motivation behind that? What's the
So they're
purpose
not
behind it?
asking
Yeah.
themselves these questions, right? They're basically jumping into the solutions.
Yeah. That's quite often what we see. They just jump into a solution and go like, and they assume that that's a solution because they see someone else doing it. So so if they start to lose market share, if the customers, if their whatever metric they're using, their customer experience or customer metric is dropping, they're like, oh, our customers are not happy with us. We saw a competitor use an AI empowered chatbot. We need one of those too. And you're like, well, no, I mean, like, why are your customers unhappy with your service, right? Is it because your retail branch person is just like has made them wait like 2 hours in line? Is it because that they were unable to complete the transaction that they wanted to? Is it because no one picked up the phone when they called? So there's a whole bunch of things that can be solved, and ultimately, yes, you end up with some interesting technological solution, right? You can, yeah, I can use AI to do this, 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 and this. But when you understand what you're trying to fix, then it becomes so much of contextual, and then you understand why you need to spend money on that technology. Because when you say you want to spend money on technology, a lot of people don't fundamentally understand how much some of this technology can cost, and then they balk, right? They see the price tag, like, oh my god, I wanted AI, but I didn't think it would cost this much money, right? So so it helps when you understand why you're trying to solve it. Then you can see what's the value in spending on that technology.
So let's talk a little bit about the workshop because I remember it had a pretty interesting structure or maybe more of a concept where it was open sourcing innovation, right? Like you were trying to get the whole organization involved in creating, creating, documenting, and pushing forward creative ideas. So, how did that work? Like, what tools were you using? What was the process like? Could you share a little bit about that?
Sure. So just taking one step back, in that culture piece that we did just before the workshop's creation, as we were going through the world and kind of meeting our colleagues around, we were identifying like great ideas that our colleagues were executing in market. And the common question we always ask is, why isn't this being done in the rest of your unit? Why hasn't this been applied in Hong Kong or China or the US? And this would be interesting solutions that the Philippines team in the middle of nowhere has figured out for themselves. And we're like, you should use this in Hong Kong. Hong Kong has this same problem, right? And they're like, oh no, we're just a small Filipino team. Hong Kong is the headquarters. They must know everything. They are probably doing something even better than what we're doing. And from our point of view, we understand more about how the rest of the organization is working. We're like, no, they actually have that you are actually running more efficiently than the Hong Kong operation. And so we got this point, like, how do we surface all these great ideas from our entire organization, so it's transparent, everyone can see, and everyone can kind of raise a voice and collectively improve the idea. And so we landed on essentially crowdsourcing, if you want to use the technical term for it. But what we really wanted to do at the workshop was how to foster and empower a culture of open innovation throughout the entire organization. And we fundamentally believe that the best ideas do not come from HQ and do not come from the person with the biggest paycheck. So that was really the seed of the workshop. We started with a crowdsourcing tool, and that was provided by a third-party provider called Spigot. We rolled that out under the brand name called The Kitchen. I think we wanted the wording of The Kitchen because our CEO was very he had a great statement. It's like we have within a large company we have the best ingredients, but we are still unable to serve out the Michelin star recipes to our customers, even though we have all these great ingredients which are the envy of the rest of our industry. We still can't put it together. And so we thought, okay, so I think a kitchen's a great analogy. Like you having the best ingredients is one thing, but you need the kitchen to kind of cook it all up and put it together into a single dish and serve it up. So that was the kitchen. And then we grew that out to sort of if you follow the journey of innovation as a culture and open innovation, we started running what we call guerrilla sessions, which is essentially fireside chats with some external speakers coming in to kind of give us a different viewpoint on potentially the industry and some of the challenges that we're facing. We obviously understood that because we wanted to stay open, it's all about the community and not just community internally, but the community externally. How do we start bringing in the startup ecosystem and engaging them, not in a we want to hire you or pay for your services or do a POC of you, but like, hey guys, we're a large multinational. We are learning. We want to be part of the process with you guys in the startup world. It's not adversarial. We're here to learn together. How do we build this community, and start to have that conversation? And additionally, what we found was that all the other large multinationals all were effectively doing the same thing, and all were learning the same lessons. So we started to convene some community events around multinational innovation teams. And I think you will know this. Most innovation teams are like one or two man or woman teams in a large company with very little resources. Probably is part of their job. If not, they have a whole bunch of other stuff they have to do. And it's just through sheer passion of wanting to improve their own organization are doing what they're doing. And we essentially try to build a support group around that. Go like, look, we're all learning the same thing. Why don't we share? Even I think at one point we had like two essentially competitors in the same room, and our view is like obviously don't share like market critical information, but the experience, the learnings we can share openly because I think with innovation practitioners that's a lot easier as opposed to sales.
So let's step forward. Let's fast forward to Human at Work and maybe compare and contrast the workshop, the kitchen, with this innovator in residence program that you have at Human at Work. That's, as I understand it, designed to supercharge startups to scale and compete,
Yep,
correct?
yep.
So, how does that compare and contrast with the kitchen?
It's a very different lens. So the kitchen and the workshop, everything was geared around effectively helping a multinational adapt a more innovative culture and mindset. The Supercharger in Residence program is catered towards startups which are starting to scale. The opportunity that we saw here, and I think we organically fell into this, was because we were doing it already with a few startups. Was that as the startup starts to scale, they start to hit the problems that large multinationals have already solved in terms of operations, some of their strategy. I think if you're under 20 men and everyone is in a room, that's great. Everything is you're knocking out of the park. When you start to want to scale to multiple countries and multiple offices, then you start to face all the problems that every large company has gone through. Like, how do you put operations in place? How do you make sure how do you make sure your culture is kind of still intact when you open a new office? Market entry into a new country. Like simple procedure, like just procedural things, like how do you hire people before, like, yeah, okay, you can just get a candidate in, see the co-founders interview him or her, a couple of maybe the function heads interview him or her, and that's great. How do you do that when you start to grow into like the 100, 200, 300 people team? You can't do that with the co-founder constantly interviewing people. You need to build a process, and put that in place. So that's a lot of the work that I've been doing with some of the startups in terms of the supercharging, to help them think through help them to stay focused and help them grow in a structured way, as opposed to just grow blindly and then kind of fix the problems afterwards.
So I've got one more question before we wrap up, and it goes back to what you're doing now as a chief innovation officer. Given these times, what's all that's happening with COVID-19, many chief innovation officers are struggling right now to kind of figure out what to focus on. So, my question to you is, what are you focusing on as a chief innovation officer?
In terms of focus for my clients, when I advise, would be to stay true to your cause. Be very, now more than any other time, you need to know why you're here, and what you're trying to achieve, and where you want to go. I think a lot of the time people just forget, because this challenge A comes out of left field, challenge B comes out of right field. You're constantly firefighting, and yes, it's much easier said than done. I totally understand this, but it's you need to at some point just take a breather or stop and see whether what you're doing still makes sense. In the way that this world is changing so dramatically. That's what you're doing right now. Is the fire you're trying to put out right now going to be relevant in 5 years' time? I always go back to like a quote I remember reading in the Financial Times during the financial crisis. The everyone was so focused on examining the grains of sand on a beach that they didn't see the tsunami coming. So
Hmm.
I think you need to stop at some point, and now more than other, because like a lot of people are just slow bleeding out. Business is drying up. Um, you need to take the pain sometimes and just start to look at potential places to pivot, and just stay true to your cause and what you're trying to do, and whether that actually by doing that you actually figure out whether you should have a place in this world really.
Yeah, that's great advice. I like that. I like the fact that you're saying embrace what's happening right now. Don't try to react so quickly all the time. Just try to stay quiet and figure out what's happening, and then step out of that quietness into a more leveraged position. So, Ihu, if people want to learn more about you and what you do, maybe learn more about Human at Work, what's the best way to do that?
Reach out to me on LinkedIn. We have a website. Email me. Just yeah, and anywhere you see me digitally, we have a contact me button. Just go right through.
Fantastic. So, I will link your LinkedIn profile in the show notes. Thank you so much for being on the show, you.
Thank you very much, Annie. Always a pleasure.